of my craft projects today are choose your own adventure style. You can either choose to decorate for every day or for Christmas. Hey everyone, thanks for coming to hang out with me again today. If you're new here, my name's Jess. I'm really excited to share these projects with you. I hope you're excited too. Let's get started. I saw this tassel and wood bead wall decor on the Hobby Lobby website, and I knew I could use a few things from the Dollar Tree to recreate it and also make it changeable so that I could go from every day to Christmas. The Dollar Tree has these wood bead wreath forms already out. I also grabbed some of the yarn that they sell there, and I raided my mom's stash for some red and green yarn as well. The wood beads on this form were pretty tight, and you can see at the top of the wreath, it's just two pieces of wire that are hooked together. I needed to remove one bead so that I would have a little bit more wiggle room to work with. It was pretty easy. I used some needle nose pliers, and I was able to bend the hook back so that I could take off one bead, and then I just reformed it and hooked it back together. Next, I got to work on my tassels. Normally when I make tassels, I use something smaller, but because I wanted these tassels to be pretty long, I looked around my craft room and I have this mini scoreboard that's about 10 inches long, so I figured that would be a good length for these tassels. You could use a piece of cardboard or a picture frame, anything you have on hand that's a little bit longer. I started by laying one piece of yarn horizontally across my scoreboard, and then I just started wrapping the yarn around the whole thing. I probably ended up doing about 30 to 35 wraps around just until I felt like there was enough thickness there to make a nice tassel. Once I had it wrapped around the whole way, that piece that I had laid down horizontal, I tied at the top, and then I was able to snip the bottom to separate all of the fringes. I took one more piece of that same yarn, and about an inch from the top, I just tied it around to finish off my tassel. After I had that little piece of yarn in place, I did go through on the bottom and just make sure that all of the ends were even. I picked out 3 different colors for my wood bead wreath, but you could do as many or as little as you'd like. I created 2 tassels of each color, and because I did remove that one bead from the wreath form, I had a little bit of room that I could tie the tassels in between each bead. I used the hooks at the top of the wreath form to help me find the center along the bottom, and that's where I placed my first tassel. I'm starting with the white tassel here, and I just did one tie. I didn't tie it in a knot. I just tied it around once, and because of the tension of the beads, that's what helped keep it in place. The tails of the tassel I just tucked behind and laid it in the back. And then as I went through my wreath form, I found that because my tassels were a bit thicker, it was better spacing for me to skip 2 beads in between each tassel. So you can see I started with the white ones in the center. I skipped 2 beads. I did another white one, and then I skipped 2 more beads, and I started in on my yellow and then the purple. So depending on the thickness of the yarn that you choose, you may want to skip more beads or skip only 1 bead. You'll just have to play around with what you're using to see how it works for you. You could choose to add a bow to the top of your wreath form, but I wanted to keep mine kind of simple, and I didn't care for how the hooks were exposed at the top. So using some of that white yarn again, I just tied a piece on, and I just started wrapping it around until I had all of the hooks covered, and it was thick enough to blend in with the 2 beads that were already at the top of the wreath form. If you wanted to switch this out from everyday decor to Christmas decor, it's really easy. You just have to untie the tassels that you want to remove from the wreath. In my case, I'm just going to take off the purple tassels and the yellow tassels. I'm going to leave the white ones in the center, and I made some green tassels and some red tassels to add on for Christmas. That's why I tied the white ones in the center. I could leave those there and just add the green and red to either side. I also wanted to show you that because the green and red yarn were different brands than the white yarn, the tassels formed a bit longer, even though I used the same board to create them. So after I had them tied on, I just combed them all out with my fingers and then used my scissors to trim them to the same length as the white ones. The Dollar Tree always has different types of wooden block houses that are easy to make over to fit any decor. I grabbed one of those, a scrap piece of scrapbook paper, one of the Dollar Tree cork sheets, and of course I'm going to have to use some Christmas greenery, some regular greenery, and I'll need a scrap piece of cardboard. To get started, there were a few embellishments on this house that I wanted to remove first. If you happen to find one that doesn't have any of these things, you don't have to worry about it. This had a little roof piece on it, and I really wanted to try to save this to reuse it. So I used my metal spatula, and I was able to slip it right underneath there and pull it off with no problem. I removed a little bit of the excess paper that stuck to it, and I put it to the side. I forgot to mention it, but this house is going to be double-sided, so you can choose to have it out for Christmas or every day. I'm going to get started on the Christmas side, so I'm using some of my favorite paper glue, which is the art glitter glue. I'll have that linked in the description box below if you're interested in it. I put a pretty thin coat over the whole surface of the house, and then I laid my scrapbook piece of paper on top of it, and I smoothed it out with a squeegee just to get any little air bubbles out and to smooth out any lumpy parts of the glue. I cut off a good bit of the excess of the scrapbook paper, and normally this is where I would use a sanding block to start sanding the scrapbook paper away from the piece that I'm working on. But my sanding block kind of disintegrated on my last project, and I didn't have another one on hand, so I did have a pack of the sandpaper from the Dollar Tree, and I tried using that. It worked, but this sandpaper is really flimsy. It started to crack apart and it was just really hard to use. So after I had most of the paper sanded off the house, then that's when I realized I did have nail files on hand. So I pulled out one of my old nail files and I just finished up with that. Before I moved on with the Christmas side of this house, I needed to apply the backer of the cork sheet to the other side. So I laid it on my cutting mat. I cut off most of the excess, and these cork sheets are really great to work with because they do have an adhesive backer to them. So once I had it about the same size as the house, I took the backer off, laid the house back on top of it, and stuck it down. I placed it back on my cutting mat, and using my utility knife again, I just cut around the edges. This was pretty easy because it was mostly all straight lines. I went back to that roof piece that I had removed in the beginning, and I didn't care for the brown color next to the cork sheet, so I just took some white chalk paint and a little paintbrush, and I dry brushed a little bit of the paint over it just to lighten it up. After the paint was dry, I used some hot glue and I just replaced it onto the house. I also needed to create a roof for the Christmas side and to cover up the raw edges on the top, so I grabbed a pack of these super jumbo craft sticks that I get at Walmart, and using my paper trimmer, I cut them down to the size that would fit across the top of the roof. Using the same white chalk paint, I gave both pieces of craft stick a good thick coat of it, and I made sure that I got all of the edges and the bottom side as well. And once those were dry, I used some hot glue again to glue those onto the pitch of the roof. I made sure that I kept the one side flush with the cork side and let the overhang on the Christmas side. I also wanted to create a wreath for each side of my house, so I grabbed a spool of ribbon that fit nicely inside each side of the house, and I traced it on that scrap piece of cardboard. Once I had each circle cut out, then I went through the center and cut out another small circle to create my wreath form. For the Christmas wreath, I grabbed 2 pieces of garland ties that had wire in the center. I trimmed off some of the excess pine needles. I formed them into C shapes, and I was able to glue them on each side of my circle. Then I wanted to keep the decorating on the wreath simple because it is a smaller wreath, so I just hot glued on some red frosted berries and also some gold glitter berries. For the wreath on the everyday side, I wanted to cover up the cardboard first because I wasn't sure if my greenery would camouflage that enough. So I took some of these silk leaves that I had in my big bag of greenery scraps. I removed the plastic stem from the center, and I just started laying them over the cardboard, hot gluing them in place and cutting off any of the excess. You could also just paint the cardboard green or cover it with green paper or even some kind of burlap fabric, but I'm always trying to find ways to use up some of these random leaves that I have in my giant bag of greenery scraps. And just like with the other wreath, I didn't want this to get too big because it is a bit small. So I just started grabbing little pieces of greenery out of that same big bag and I started hot gluing them around the outside. I didn't really have a pattern to it. I just wanted to get the surface as full as I could without making it too large. This is a great way to use up some of the scrap pieces you might have from some bouquets that you've created. Or if you didn't have any greenery on hand, I think this piece of cardboard would look really cute just wrapped in twine and put a bow on it. Or you could even fill the whole thing with just flowers. It's really up to you and your style. You could just use hot glue and glue these wreaths right to the center of each side of the house, but I wanted mine to be able to come off in case I needed to lay it flat against something. So I'm just using some Velcro dots. I placed one side on the house, the other side on the wreath form, and that way I can just Velcro it on and off of each side. I had this frame on hand from another project that I wanted to reuse. I also had the piece of canvas material from another frame, so I wanted to create a simple way to create a centerpiece for either everyday or Christmas. I'm also going to be using some foam blocks, some chipboard, and some burlap. To get started, I took the piece of chipboard that I had cut down to fit on the back side of my frame. I added some hot glue and I placed it onto that canvas piece of material on the canvas side so that when I flipped it over, the linen side of that material would be the side that showed. Once I had that glued into place, I just took my rotary cutter on my cutting mat and I just cut off all of the excess of the canvas material. I laid that canvas material on the chipboard first because this burlap had a pretty loose weave to it and I didn't want you to see the chipboard through the burlap. I'd rather see that material. So once that was in place, I took my burlap, I added a dot of hot glue to each corner of the chipboard and I just laid the burlap over it. I used my spatula because, like I said, this is a pretty loose weave and I knew that glue would come through and I didn't want to burn my fingers. Once all of the burlap was in place, then I used my same rotary cutter and I just cut off the excess. I'm not too worried about the raw edges of the materials on this because it will lay under the frame and you won't be able to see it. After my chipboard was covered in both of my fabrics, I used some hot glue along the back side of the frame and placed it back on. I wanted to create two different centerpieces for on my tray. I wanted to stack up a couple pieces of styrofoam to help get the right shape that I wanted, and I only had one of these green forms that's, I don't even know what it is. It looks like a part of a cone. So since it looks like a part of a cone, I just took another floral cone and I cut it down to about the same size as the original piece. I don't know why, but I feel like the Dollar Tree hasn't had these smaller green foam forms in as often. You'll have to let me know in the comments if your Dollar Tree is getting them as often. Maybe it's something they're getting rid of. I don't know, but I'm sure you could find them at Michael's or Walmart even. Next, I got started on my Christmas centerpiece. Now, I've mentioned it before on my channel. I'm not the greatest at arranging flowers. I really struggle with proportions and stuff like that when it comes to flower arranging. I don't know why. That's why I wanted to build this styrofoam shape up first. I thought it would help me in the end to get everything placed better because the shape would already be there for me. Now, if you're better at flower arranging, you could probably just use one small floral foam block and just go to town on it. But the reason I glued these two together was just to help me arrange it a little bit easier. After I had that base layer of pine garland stuck into the bottom of the two foam shapes, then I just went to town. I started adding in some silver poinsettias, some leaves. I had some pine cones I threw in there. I had a couple even Christmas balls I threw in there, and I finished it with some red poinsettias too. So again, this is why I decided to just create that foam shape first, because it made it a lot easier for me as I was adding the flowers on. It was already tiered in two different heights so that I had two different places to work with to add these different elements. When I started working on the everyday decor centerpiece for this tray, I kind of went about it the same way. I started with a base layer of fern leaves to help cover up a good bit of that bottom portion of foam, and I knew I wanted some succulents on the top. So once I had my bottom base layer in, then I moved to the top. I added the succulents I wanted, and then all the spaces in between, I just started filling in with random pieces of greenery. Now, I chose to keep my centerpieces just made out of florals, but if you wanted to, since that is a flat surface on the top, you could just decorate the bottom and add a candle into the center also, or even a small vase and add more flowers coming out of the vase. There's a lot of different options you have when you're building up a tray like this. The last thing I needed to do to turn this from a picture frame to a tray was to add some feet. I grabbed some large wooden beads that I had on hand and I just hot glued them to the bottom. Wood bead garlands are one of my favorite crafts to make. They come together pretty quick and you can change out the things on the end to fit any holiday or for every day. The wood beads that I'm going to use are pretty large. I think these are 30 millimeters. I'll have them linked in the description box below. They're from Amazon. I'm also going to be using some Christmas picks and of course my giant bag of greenery. I started out with some thinner jute twine. I folded it in half and I left about an inch and a half loop on the end before I tied a knot. I tied that knot a few times to make sure that the bead wouldn't slip over the knot. I then used some hot glue on the ends. I added a small dab. I let it cool down for a second and I rolled it between my fingers, and this just made it a lot easier to string the beads onto the jute twine. I continued putting the beads on the twine until the wood bead garland came to the length that I liked. Before I cut the excess off my wood bead garland, I started creating the tassel that I wanted to tie on that end. I'm using a small cutting mat here. I wrapped some jute twine around about 20 times, and then I cut the one end off so all of my lengths were the same. Once I took it off of that cutting mat, because I folded the jute twine in the beads in half, I had two lengths coming out the other end. So now I'm able to take my lengths of jute twine for my tassel. I laid it in between the two lengths coming out of the wood bead and I tied it together. Once I had that tied onto the beads, then I folded all of those pieces in half. I took another small piece of jute twine about an inch from where the beads ended and I tied it around those pieces of jute to create a tassel. The length that was left over, I just wrapped around the tassel and hot glued it into place to create a band. Rather than creating tassels for the other end of the garland, I decided to create mini bouquets. I took one of the Christmas picks, I clipped 3 things off, and I also had a random silver glittery branch that I thought looked cute with that. I bundled them up, I added a bit of hot glue to the ends of all 3 pieces, and I used a piece of clear tape just to help hold everything together. Once I had everything bundled up, then I grabbed some jute twine and I wrapped it around the whole tip to cover up the raw edges of the floral picks. I needed a way to tie this bundle onto the other end of the wood beads, so I grabbed another piece of that same jute twine and I just tied it around the top of my bundle. Then I took some red gingham ribbon that I had in my stash. I created a small bow and I just hot glued it onto the top. And because I left that loop on one end of my wood beads, I'm able to run that jute twine right through that loop and tie it in a bow, and that's how I connected it to my wood beads. I did the same thing with a few pieces of greenery, creating a small bouquet, finishing it off with some jute twine, and this time instead of a red gingham ribbon, I did a blue gingham ribbon, and I'm able to switch out the ends of my wood bead either to everyday with my greenery pick or with my Christmas one. Thanks for hanging out in the craft room with me today. Remember, if you ever make anything that I create, tag me on Instagram at gluelalacrafts because I'd love to see it. All right, everyone, I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one.